seated. Does any other member wish to speak? The elected member for Town West.
Mr. Speaker, thanks very much for this opportunity to address this honorable house. First, I would like to congratulate the Premier and his elected government for bringing this SPS document on time. And I would also like to thank the many civil servants that worked diligently in preparing it.
Honorable
Um,
member, could you, Premier, I think we passed the hour of adjournment. It is 1,000 times.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move the suspension of Standing Order 10-2 in order that the business of the House may continue beyond the hour of interruption.
The question is that the standing orders be suspended in order for the House to carry on beyond the hour of 4:30. All in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. Honorable member for Town West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Gentlemen, I have the floor now. Thank you. Um, Sorry, and ladies, I apologize. Well, they weren't actually saying anything, just the. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Mr. Speaker, apologies. I, first of all, really want to thank everyone that prepared this document. I know putting together these budgets and these assumptions are never easy, and I have no intention of taking a critical approach to say what should have been in it and what shouldn't have been in it. It's been a very short period of time since the election, and to have gotten such a document done on time would have undoubtedly taken a lot of time to complete, and it is not in my style to criticize work that people have put in. Mr. Speaker, next year will be 20 years since I returned from college, and I had received an education that was paid for by the people of this country. And Mr. Speaker, the people of Town West didn't elect me to come down here and just oppose for the sake of oppose or criticize. I received an education was an investment by the people of the Cayman Islands with the view that one day me and many from my generation will come back and contribute. And as such, my remarks today, Mr. Speaker, is in hope that the Premier and his team would consider certain things as they put together the budget, as they put together the budget for the next 2 years. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, I just want to kind of touch on, and I just bear indulgence a bit. It was a conversation 2 days ago between yourself, the Honorable Premier, when we were in your chamber briefly. And I was explaining to you the mindset that I was using or I'll be planning on taking to this Honorable House. And the Honorable Premier asked me at that time, he said, well, Mr. Saunders, I would bet it's something that you would repeat to the other members of the House, and I promised him that I would. So I just want to bear your indulgence a little bit so you guys can understand pretty much where the mindset is coming from. Mr. Speaker, I made reference to an interview that was done by the late Michael Manley of Jamaica, the former Prime Minister, in 1977 in New York. And I would encourage members to take a look at that. It's on YouTube. At which point, Mr. Manley was a man ahead of his time, a brilliant man, brilliant interview. And most people would agree that what he had to say was actually quite solid. And then the next interview I like most people to watch also is the one he did a year before he died and a year after he left office. And the interviewer asked him how could he have gotten everything so right in theory and everything went so wrong in practical? To which Mr. Manley replied, he learned three lessons. One, he used language that frightened away business people and investors from his country, and he needed those people to create jobs. Two, he used language that frightened the middle class, that resulted in the biggest brain drain that up to the time of that interview he regretted. And three, he overestimated the political awareness of the Jamaican people. With that in mind, what he was basically saying is that he wished he had spent more time trying to explain to the Jamaican people what it was that he wanted to do, the bigger picture. So, Mr. Speaker, as I went through the SPS, and in preparing for the SPS, there are two documents I started out with. One was the annual economic report of 2016, and the other was last year's SPS. Because what I wanted to see, Mr. Speaker, was what the government said last year, what they achieved, and also what it is that they're looking to do this year. Now, I am mindful, Mr. Speaker, that the cabinet of last year versus the cabinet of this year has 4 new members. So in essence, more than half the government has changed. So I would expect that there would have been some changes in policy and in terms of what the assumptions that would be used and also what the priorities of the government would be. What I would like to ask the government to consider as they put together the budget over the next 2 years is Brexit in terms of the impact to our financial industry and also tourism. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I look at the SPS, I realize that a lot of it is actually predicated on the construction industry. And Mr. Speaker, I think it's important for us in this house and for also for the wider public to understand just how the Cayman economy works. We have 2 pillars, which is banking and tourism. And if you look at page 6 of the annual economic report 2016, prepared by the Economics and Statistics Office, you will see that there is challenges within the economy as a lot of the stuff that underpin the pillar for our economy, Mr. Speaker, is actually in decline. And you look at the tourism numbers also, you see that they're also flat. And Mr. Speaker, following on from the conversation I was having with you on Monday, and that was also joined by the Premier, I think it's important for us as a people and as a country and as members of this legislative assembly embark on developing a national strategic plan for this country. This year would be 20 years, Mr. Speaker, since we started on Vision 2008. And that document itself didn't go quite far because, one, it was led by the governor with very little political buy-in. And as a result, the people who ultimately had to bring those recommendations into play didn't really feel a part of it. More than anything, Mr. Speaker, is that we need to go out and have that conversation with the Caymanian people in terms of what we want the country to look like in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Kind of develop a plan for Cayman in 2030. The challenge, Mr. Speaker, and I would say this much, a lot of people have this belief that the government should run like a business. The government can't run like a business. The government is here to provide a service. And I think people need to understand that in business, you can increase your revenues and you basically take revenues from somebody else. In government, when you increase your revenues, you're actually taxing more. And even if somebody loses something, the reality of everybody's affected. So everything stays, it's a zero-sum game. And the thing is, Mr. Speaker, that we need to be mindful of is that when we look at the Cayman economy, and as with most businesses, and it is driven by businesses, the bulk of the revenues that businesses make in both the financial services industry and in the tourism industry come from people overseas. But the expenses are domestic. So there's already a disconnect between our businesses earn revenue and our expenses are incurred. And that is what makes the Cayman economy unique. And whether we like it or not, it is a very fragile economy the way in which it is set up. because it means that we are, in a sense, affected by external forces. The Honorable Leader of the Opposition in his contribution spoke about businesses developing a social conscience. The reality of it is, if you look at most of the businesses, and I will use banks for example, Mr. Speaker, is that their shareholders and their owners, except for maybe Cayman National Bank, are not Caymanians. So their social conscience that they would have, or we would expect them to have, really and truly wouldn't exist because their priorities are elsewhere. So it is important for us, Mr. Speaker, is that we maintain an environment that business feel welcome. And seeing what the government has put in the SPS, as the Honorable Leader of the Opposition said, it's kind of hard to argue against what is included. What I would ask the government to be mindful of is that we have reached a point in Cayman where our economic power has now surpassed our political power. And ultimately, the people in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, is the one who's held responsible for this country. Mr. Speaker, as I go through the SPS, I'm actually reminded that the way in which our structure is set up, we have a lot of challenges. First of all, you look at the United States. They have monetary policies, fiscal policies, just like every other country or most industrial country. We don't have that. All we have is fiscal policy, which is pretty much what the budget represents. And if you look at the things that people mostly complain about, which is inflation and unemployment, and you were to take a look at the Federal Reserve Bank in the US or the Federal Reserve System, you will see that of the 5 priorities of the Federal Reserve, that 2 of the things that they're actually charged with is controlling inflation and controlling unemployment. That is something that has not really been given or tasked to the politicians. So, Mr. Speaker, the challenge for us as elected people, and every single one in this chamber, except for the ex-official members, are here by votes. We get votes by being popular, but we also have to balance now with the responsibilities that we have between what is popular versus what is right. And, Mr. Speaker, that's why 2 of the 3 motions that I call for, rather than try to go through and start making wholesale changes to the law, is to set up those select committees to address those issues where we have to find a balance. Because the reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, we in this chamber are the ones that are held responsible for when things go bad within our economy. And we need to ensure that the people in this chamber, the members of this chamber in this honorable house, have the power to deal with the responsibilities that they have been given by the people. So, Mr. Speaker, as I contemplate the SPS, and I was listening to my colleague from Newland speak about the turtle farm, I also did an analysis on the turtle farm in prior years. And what I did was that I realized that the government at that time, if I remember serving right, and I just bear the house for its indulgent, was subsidizing turtle farm to the tune of 10 million, of which 6 million was there to service debt. So the true subsidy to the turtle farm was really 4 million, because if you close it down, you'd have to pay the 4 million. Then I had to ask myself the question, the turtle farm, I think, employs around 100 people, 95% of which came in directly, and it creates another 400 and something jobs indirectly. So when you look, and then at the same time, I think they have, about maybe a couple 100,000 visitors per year. So then the question, Mr. Speaker, is that for a true subsidy of $4 million that creates 500 jobs directly, indirectly, and have a tourist attraction of over 100,000 people, the question is, does 4 million present value for money? And at that point, I decided, you know what, Chris, I'll leave the turtle farm alone, because for 4 million, you really can't argue with that. So, Mr. Speaker, I mean, these are the kind of challenges that governments have, and I'm very aware. I haven't been a banker myself, and I have to be sitting down and looking at future lending that people may probably have, where interest rates may go, and also at the same time consider what the overall economy would look like, both government policy, but also at the same time international impacts such as interest rate, foreign exchange, and everything else. And Mr. Speaker, the thing about it with the SPS, and I would just caution the government for this one thing, is that the two pillars is still finance and tourism. Construction is a byproduct of those two industries. So if you look at the big homes that are being built, they're being built by partners and law firms, accounting firms. That's where the primary source still comes from. The construction is secondary. If we're building hotels, it is still the tourism industry. Construction is still secondary. And as such, we need to relook at our investment in those two areas in terms of the pillars. One, I'm glad to see that the government is actually spending more money in Cayman finance because I think we need to invest with the members of the financial services industry to ensure that the impact from Brexit and even Mr. Trump oversees that we prepare our own economy to deal with that. But also at the same time, we also can't forget the impact of tourism. Now, I know everyone has their views on the cruise berth facilities. I still think it's a little bit too expensive, but at the same time, I'm also cognizant that last year was the first time in global tourism where cruise tourism actually had more more passengers than stay over tourism. First time ever. So the reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, is that we still need to do something when it comes on to tourism, and we also need to do something with cruise tourism. I mean, the question is, though, what? And then the question is, at what price, and also at what cost, and to what benefit to the country. And I think that is something that we need to look at. Stay over tourism, Mr. Speaker, has been the bread and butter of our economy. The spend is almost, I think, 10 times per what a cruise ship passenger would make. And the numbers are, it is the kind of what we refer to as sustainable development. Because we make money when the economy is improved or get better when we're building hotels. Because it creates jobs then, and it also creates jobs once it's up and running. So those are the kind of sustainable tourism that we need to consider. So, Mr. Speaker, what I would ask the Premier and his team to kind of take on board is to, as they sit down and deliberate with regards to the assumptions that they're going to use in the budget, is the real long-term plan. Last year's SPS, there was a medium-term plan, but again, like I said, I recognize the government had more time then versus having a new government now, and time would not have been permitted. But we still need to develop a long-term plan for this country. Mr. Speaker, another thing I need for the government to also consider as they're putting together the budget is the impact of cheap labor. Because while there have been growth in the GDP, if you look at the annual economic report of 2016, GDP per capita has actually been decreasing. And the true measure of a country is not just GDP growth, but economic productivity. Are our people doing more? So, Mr. Speaker, you could have two people in a house making $10,000 as income, and you can say the average is 5,000. You can now have the household income being 20,000, which would be growth in the household income. But if you have 10 people inside here, the average is 2,000. That decrease in average, not only just decrease in productivity, but it's also loss of wages, and it is also loss of is referred to as more like on the unemployment side. And those are the kind of things that we need to consider. The SPS is a good first start in terms of putting together the budget, Mr. Speaker. But we really need to take a long look at the assumptions that we're going to use, because at the end of the day, it still has to be on a per unit type level in the sense of what do we expect from stay over tourism, and we also what do we expect in terms of banking. Because if you go through the annual economic report, you will see that it's either flat or it is decreasing. And we also need to understand, Mr. Speaker, that we do have external forces that want to take what it is that we have. Make no doubt about it, Mr. Speaker, is that as we're sitting here, there are people in other countries thinking about how to take what the Cayman Islands have. And Mr. Speaker, I've made it perfectly clear, and as much as I can, that there are certain areas that we as politicians need to make sure that we don't play politics with. Education has got to be one of them. Healthcare has got to be one of them. social services has got to be one of them, and the finances of the country have to be one of them. And as such, Mr. Speaker, I have no intention of playing any politics in the finances of this country, recognizing the fragility of it, but at the same time, I am also cognizant that we have yet to find a formula for Caymanians to prosper within our own economy. And I think that is one of the things that we're going to be tasked with. As I showed you and the Premier on Monday, Mr. Speaker, the ratio between Caymanians and non-Caymanians in the private sector is something that needs to be reversed. Now, the private sector is the engine of our economy, and we cannot, we should not, and we must not continue to build a ratio where the engine of our economy is 60% non-Caymanian. As more hotels come on board, Mr. Speaker, and more developments are on board, in the next 5 to 10 years, that number can easily be between 65 to 70%. And Mr. Speaker, when I consider that, and having considered the fact that I've had jobs that have allowed me to visit just about every English-speaking island in the Caribbean, and as I sit there and speak to many of those people, I learn from the mistakes that many of them made. I look at Jamaica, as I was talking about earlier. Haiti is considered the poorest country in the hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere, and the 21st most poorest country in the entire world. Yet, the Haitian dollar is worth more than the US dollar. More than the Jamaican dollar. I think the Haitian dollar is around 63 to 1, and the Jamaican dollar is about 130 to 1 at the US. And there's no way in which you can sit down, or I've asked, many economists have asked, many Jamaicans who should know how is that possible, and they still can't explain that to me. And those are the kind of things, Mr. Speaker, that we need to be mindful of. We are still very dependent on doing business with overseas entities, and we can't lose sight of that. But at the same time, we also have to be mindful that if we don't find a way for Caymanians to feel as if though they can prosper in this economy, I'm going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, we're going to create a political demagogue. Brexit in England was that demagogue. Donald Trump in the US was that demagogue. And we also need to recognize now that we do have people and elements within our society that will do anything to get into power. And they will get up and they will tell the people what is popular, but they won't tell the people what is right. So, Mr. Speaker, I really don't want to get too much further into SPS. As the Honorable Premier said, we should save our firepower for the budget. But, Mr. Premier, I can assure you from now that, as I said before, I don't think the finance of this country is something we should play politics with. And I have no intention of playing politics with it. The people of this country did not give me an education for me to come back and try not to contribute to the development or the betterment of my country. But what I would want to just say to members, and this is on page 20 of the annual economic report, if we look at the population of our islands, Mr. Speaker, broken down into 3 groups: the Caymanian population, the permanent resident population, and the non-Caymanian population. Between 2015 and 2016, Mr. Speaker, the Caymanian population decreased by 124 people, and the non-Caymanian population increased by 1,072 people. That in itself, Mr. Speaker, is kind of room for concern, because we cannot continue on this path. Because the social unrest that will follow is not something that we also want to entertain. Mr. Speaker, I also want the Premier and his team to consider, when they putting together the budget, is domestic credit. Next year, banks will have to deal with IFRS 9, which will be changes to our bank provisions for losses, and also the impact of possible Basel III. Mr. Speaker, I was part of a bank that chose to move out of Cayman and no longer do business here. And having understood the decision process and what went into their decision, I am fearful that is something that can also come back again and bite us. And as you look again at bank license, and seen the gradual decreases. At one point, we were up to 587 licenses around 10 years ago. Today, we're less than 200, about 170, thereabouts. Again, this is our bread and butter, Mr. Speaker. So the reason I refer to domestic credit is that if the construction is going to be the driving force in the government achieving its priorities, the government must also be mindful then that they need to protect credit because every economy needs credit in which to survive. And that is something that, again, I'd be more than happy to sit with the government, work with the government. My education was paid for by the people. And when I do get paid every month, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't say Bordentown West, it says the Cayman Islands government. So I have a responsibility to the entire people of the Cayman Islands. And it makes no use for me to have knowledge and understanding of certain areas and not see where I can do good with it. So I just want the government to be mindful of that. By the way, Mr. Speaker, the total banks is actually down now to 159 from a high of 587. Just going through that. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, and I won't keep much longer because I recognize the time and the house has already been extended. But one of the things I also want to look at or want the government to consider, and it's from page 41 of the annual economic report, is the number of planning approvals between 2013 and 2016. Again, that is also something that has been decreasing. So we need to make sure that we do create that environment, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that our economy and everything else continues to prosper. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to close up shortly, but I also want the government to take a look in terms of the breakdown of its actual revenues. Now, going through the SPS, I noticed that a lot of the revenues remain flat year on year, pretty much flat, and a lot of the expenses remain year on year, which begs the question that if the government is going to increase some programs, it means that they're taking from some programs to achieve that goal. And I think, again, this is something that naturally somebody's going to be affected. It's not going to be where we can pluck money out of the air, Mr. Speaker. But it is, I'm just curious to know what those programs would be. And I think that's just something we just need to be mindful of because when you do look at the domestic taxes, Mr. Speaker, it has been increasing when most of the other revenue areas have been pretty much flat or decreasing. So even though the government revenue is almost relatively flat, when you look at the actual distribution of the different revenue lines, and this is just considering the 2016 annual economic report, you'll see some massive changes there. And those changes within those lines is pretty much what it is that affects people's behavior. So, Mr. Speaker, as the government embark on putting a budget out and recognizing the budget is a planning tool, I'm just going to ask the government to take some time during the throne speech and the budget process to educate the people of the Cayman Islands as to what the long-term goal and the long-term success of the Cayman should be. It's very easy for us to speak in quantitative terms, Mr. Speaker, and use numbers. But for the people of the Cayman Islands, these numbers is actually their livelihood, their lives, and their future. And it's important for us to have an honest conversation with them, to go out and have that conversation to say, listen, this is what it is, this is where we are, and this is what we're doing, and this is what we're trying to achieve. And I think we just need to make sure we don't make that mistake of overestimating the political awareness of the Caymanian people, as others before us have made, that we just take it for granted that they're seeing the bigger picture. I know some people were surprised to probably heard what I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, about Turtle Farm. But those are the kind of conversations we need to have with people. I mean, Cayman Airways itself has also had its own critics. I've never been one of them. And the reason why I've never been one of them, Mr. Speaker, is that working in telecoms and traveling to the Eastern Caribbean, I've seen U.S. carriers undercut their prices, drive the local airlines out of business, and then as soon as they drive them out, they tell them we can no longer offer jet service. It'll be turboprop, and then those governments are held hostage by paying them large subsidies just to maintain jet service. And when you look at the small population that we have, Mr. Speaker, and considering the amount of airlines that have failed from Pan Am to Eastern, Air Jamaica, and several others, and the fact that our Cayman Airways is still flying, it's still a source of pride for me. But at the same time, we also have to look at what cost. Now, Mr. Speaker, oh, no. That's all right, Mr. Speaker. Economics itself is about using scarce resources to achieve many wants. And the government does not have an easy job, and I recognize that. And every government around the world has two basic responsibilities: to ensure that you have a healthy and educated workforce to meet the demands of your country. The question has always been, do you invest in education or do you invest in health? Recognizing that you do have limited resources. And the answer has always been that you invest in education. Because once you give a man enough sense, you know to take care of himself. And that is always important. What I'm going to say, Mr. Speaker, just in closing, and it is something that I really hope the government is mindful of, is the impact of cheap labor to our economy. Left unabated, it is going to lead to serious problems in this country. And, Mr. Speaker, looking at the assumptions based on the SPS, and I remember one year the Honorable Premier was referring to the use of carrots and the use of sticks. And I will ask him and his government, as they put together the budget, to consider more sticks. And I'll tell you why. A lot of Caymanians can't find work. And a lot of Caymanians are employed in work that are actually beneath them. Mr. Speaker, if the people who couldn't find work, because our education system, Mr. Speaker, has been attacked, in a lot of cases, really unnecessary. And our people need to understand the power of labeling. Because when you say something long enough and people start believing it, the kids start believing it too. And that is a problem. Because, Mr. Speaker, if the only people who couldn't find jobs were the kids coming out of our high school, we can say it was our education system. But when we have our children coming back from North American and European universities that are now educated in those countries, you cannot blame that on our education system. And as a result, as the Honorable Leader of Opposition was speaking of his own story, I would say to those businesses, be very mindful, because the people that you're discriminating against in the workplace still holds the vote and the political power in this country. And they will, at the point of frustration, give you somebody that you will not like. So, Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Leader of the Opposition referred to it. A lot of business people look at me sometimes and say, Chris, when I listen to you, you scare me. Mr. Speaker, and I will always say to them, worry about the person who scares me. Because I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, it's not a pretty situation. A lot of our people have pride, Mr. Speaker, but they're hurting. I'm seeing it, and I can tell you, as a former banker, you have some people in this country that have some obscene bank accounts made from the backs of hardworking Caymanians. And, Mr. Speaker, I will tell you, the day we have a WikiLeaks and people in this country start understanding the level of wealth in this country, and that has been incurred from their misery, Mr. Speaker, we're going to have social problems. So, Mr. Speaker, as the government puts together its SPS, I'll again ask to look at those assumptions to find a social balance. But at the same time, I do recognize that the government has its own challenges in finding a balance. Because, again, many of us in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, is here because we received a popular vote. It doesn't necessarily mean that we received the right vote. And I would say to the Premier and his team, and anyone else, if there's anything I've discussed here today and they want for me to expand on it, I'd be more than happy to, because it was paid for by the people of the Cayman Islands. And I'm here to make my own contribution in that regard. I want the government to do well. I wish the government does well. I wish the government do very well. And as I've said to the Premier, for 3 years, I won't be the adversarial type, but I do recognize that this is also an house of adversarial behavior. And while Chris won't draw first blood, Mr. Speaker, I can guarantee you I will draw last blood. So I'm here to help the government in any way that I can. Again, I congratulate the Premier and his team for putting together this document in such a short time, and I really wish them well. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank this House for indulging me these few little moments, and I'll wrap up. I finish. Thanks. Can't drop the mic, sorry.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member?
Mr. Speaker,
The member for Georgetown Central.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to give my response and contribution to the Premier's speech on the SPS, and to kind of give in summary my thoughts of what I've heard so far today by the minister responsible for financial services, for finance, I apologize, the Premier and his team. I must say there was a level of excitement for what I've heard. It may not be everything I wanted to hear, but there was a lot of pleasing things that I heard today. Matter of fact, in comparison with my manifesto, I went through it shortly throughout other members' contribution, and I found that almost a little over 70% of the things that I campaigned on and wanted to implement if I was to be a part of the ruling government was in the strategic policy statement. So, starting out with that, I want to congratulate the Minister for Finance and the Premier for what they have outlined will be the plan for their administration moving forward for the next 2 years. I must acknowledge, though, that the word broad was always stated in most of the presentation, which only leads me to conclude that that's the hope, which is good enough for me to start with. I believe that every journey starts with the first step. And because I'm a newbie in this House of Parliament, and for many of those who may be watching at home, to understand the process of the next 2 years, as I understand it, the government will present a strategic policy statement which broadly outlines their plan for the next 2 years up until the end of, or the start of 2020. Then the budget shall come to the House, where we will debate and the government will present their allocations for that plan that was outlined in the strategic policy statement. And then they will get hard at work of doing it and getting it done with the great civil servants that we have. So, again, I go back to the word being broad. Some may say that's a very hopeful in respect to what they presented, but I respect the fact that they have started at a place where I'm comfortable with. I think many of the members in the House will know that majority of my campaign was based on social concerns, social ills, as that was one of the main issues for me in respect to the past administration, their lack of focus and attention on the social concerns. And I want to congratulate the Premier on an announcement he publicly said a couple of weeks back, I can't remember exactly when it was, that for him and his team, that they will be focusing on a lot of the that the Premier and his team will be focusing a lot on the social ills that the country is facing. And Mr. Speaker, that is very good news to me. I want to take the opportunity to highlight some of the things that I've heard the Honorable Premier say in his statement presented to this House that gives me some level of comfort, Mr. Speaker, that what is being presented in this strategic policy statement can be more than just words in a document. If we look at the realities of politics, the Honorable Premier is on his second round as the Premier of this country. And constitutionally, Mr. Speaker, he cannot do another term unless he intends to skip one administration. So I think there's a level of want and hope by the Honorable Premier to really leave his legacy on addressing something that may have been seen for him as a hurdle in his last administration. And I feel the sentiments coming out in much public appearances as well as in his speech. And I'm going to go to a paragraph in his speech, and I know that all the members have a copy of the Premier's speech now, where he said on page 5 that I will be leaving everything on the field. That resonated with me because I feel I'm getting the attitude that he plans to go really hard on what he said in this strategic policy statement. So I'm hopeful, but reserved. I just want to go through a number of things, Mr. Speaker, that I heard in the strategic policy statement delivered here today that was in my manifesto, and show how some may say, well, Mr. Bryan, you're supporting the government quite often, or giving a lot of support to the government, and you're an opposition member. But as I said in my first delivery in this House, I'm not here to oppose, but just because I'm on the opposition side, if I hear the things that I think is good for this country, I'm going to support it. That's what the people of Georgetown Central sent me here to do. So I want to highlight some of the things that are already in my manifesto that were highlighted here today to show that there is reason for me to support this administration if, in fact, they will follow through with what has been presented here today. Some of the things like to develop a national tourism plan can be found on page 4 of my manifesto. To review the minimum wage can be found on page 6 of my manifesto. And bear with me, Mr. Speaker, as I made some notes of the speech presented by the Premier. One of the things that is not in my manifesto, but I want to highlight my support for it, Mr. Speaker, is the warden concept or warden approach to policing. Actually, in my manifesto, I suggested a warden approach to the communities across the island for keeping an eye on persons who litter, because littering was a serious issue for me, and the environment is a serious issue for me, and the best way to police it is have us all police ourselves. So a concept of you catch somebody littering, you can possibly get a reward, or have senior persons in your community who will keep an eye out for those things. And though I didn't have a warden approach to policing the neighborhoods, it's quite similar to what I had in respect to my manifesto. So I understand the concept and I support it. Moving on now to a very serious issue, which I'm so glad to hear this current administration intends to address, is the border control, both at the airports and the waters. It's also in my manifesto on page 8. Another element that was highlighted by the Honorable Premier on page 17 of his speech, he says, I believe most significant contribution to crime reduction will come from the early identification of young people at risk of offending behavior and putting programs in place to support them to make better life choices. I couldn't say those words better myself, so I agree with that. Also, by way of the strategic policy statement, Mr. Speaker, this administration is committing themselves to ensuring people have access to quality, affordable health care. Also in my manifesto on page 12, I have not had much time to digest the concept of what has been presented in the SBS about Cineco and broadening Cineco's persons who are on Cineco benefits to more providers on island, and what the health provider community is going to respond to that. But anything to make sure that Caymanians have better opportunities at healthcare, I support. Also, the Premier spoke of finding better ways to procure pharmaceuticals and medical supplies. Another thing that was in my manifesto on page 12. Mr. Speaker, I can go on and on about how many things that was done or what was said by the Minister of Finance and the Honorable Premier Alden McLaughlin that is in my manifesto, but I'm not going to basically promote myself and about my manifesto. Today is the government's day. But the reason I had to highlight so many of the different points that correlate with my manifesto is because of the support that I intend to give them in respect to their plan for the next 4 years. Because politically, my understanding of a strategic policy statement is a roadmap of what to expect from the government in the next 2 years, at least the next budget cycle. So if in fact, which I highlighted that the Premier suggested that he plans to leave it all in the field, that he's going to be genuine with that and push that very hard. So I believe that this statement, some may see it as politics in hot air, because I've heard comments like that before in other strategic policy statements, that, yeah, high hopes, but they never get it done. I think the circumstances that present itself right now, today, in this environment, with this Premier on his last round, understanding the last administration, it was a hurdle for them. Understanding the fact that it's a unity government with different views, I truly believe that there is an opportunity that all of those high hopes that were presented in the strategic policy statement can be fulfilled. I want to also take this opportunity to address the Premier's comments on two motions that I plan to bring to the House. First being that of the increase in benefits to the seamen of this country. It's already been reported in the media that my motion intends to ask the government to consider increasing the seamen benefits to 1,000 Cayman Islands dollars. But I understand today, by way of the strategic policy statement presented by the Honorable Premier, that the government has already considered that, and I'm hoping, Mr. Speaker, that it's because of my motion being presented that they're willing to consider it. So my work is already starting to become fruitful. Though the motion that I put forward was 1,000, and the government intends to increase it from $550 to $750 over the next 2 years. It's not what I wanted, but I think that the people who are going to be the beneficiaries of it would be grateful. I also want to highlight that the government intends to not only highlight or increase the seamen veterans, but also persons who are in poor relief, as well as civil servants, pensioners who don't make a lot of pension. So they're covering a lot more than what I've covered in my motion, so that I can understand that maybe they couldn't go to the 1,000, which I wanted, but I respect the fact that they have considered it already, and tomorrow when the motion will be presented to the House, I'm considering withdrawing my motion, and I want to say thank you to this administration and the Premier for already taking considerations to my motion. The Premier, Honorable Alden McLaughlin, also spoke on my other motion in respect to finding or acquiring or building temporary housing for persons who get assistance from the Needs Assessment Unit. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Premier used the word that hurt a little bit by saying my motion wasn't practical. But maybe it wasn't, because I don't have access to the knowledge and accounts of the government. So I can only make my assumptions from this side. And maybe I may not have come to the same conclusion that he did if I was there, or I did if I was on his side. He suggested that it's not practical for government to go ahead and build 50 two-bedroom apartments to address the problem of persons trying to find temporary housing because of the failures in the private sector for the various reasons of government not providing deposits, government paying late, private sector don't necessarily want to rent to families with kids, and a host of other different issues which are causing the private sector realtor market not to be there for those who are in need. But the Premier did say that he acknowledges the problem. And again, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to think that because of my motion being brought to this House, or intended to bring to this House, the current administration is now considering to make the necessary changes so we can at least fix the problem. And again, it may not be exactly what I intended, but ultimately our job and our goal here in the Legislative Assembly is to find a solution. It don't necessarily has to be my solution, as long as the solution is found. And according to the Honorable Premier, I want to see if I can find where he said it exactly in his speech so I can not misquote him. but it may take me a while going through his whole speech because it's rather long. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to ad-lib in saying that they can find other ways to fix the problem without acquiring or building 50 apartment units for persons who are in temporary need of housing. And he also highlighted the concern of competing with the private sector market for rental units. So I can understand that perspective of that reservation, but I'm glad to see that he's committed to finding some of the solution that has created the lack in housing opportunity for those who are in need of it by way of securing and making sure that government pays on time to those landlords who actually do take the risk and go out and help those who are in need. Secondly, to consider making deposits available for those who have temporary assistance, and working with the rental market for them to consider families that are coming through the needs assessment unit. So I intend to have further discussions with the government in respect to that second motion, and my gut feeling is telling me that there's a high chance I may withdraw that motion as well, because it seems to me that the current administration have already considered both of my motions and already taken the necessary steps to address them. And I must say that I am proud of you for that. Now, I'm not going to overextend myself and think that I'm a well-experienced politician, Mr. Speaker, and try to go on and on. But I would like to also highlight, though, that there are some parts of my manifesto that I campaigned on that are not in the strategic policy statement. And by all means, I believe that there are some things that don't necessarily come in the strategic policy statement that can also be addressed through ways of their administrative work with the various different departments. And one of them in particular, for me, is immigration enforcement. I think many of us here would remember that throughout the campaign, a major problem for me Mr. Speaker, a major problem for me throughout the campaign was the lack of protection for job opportunities in this country. And much of those persons who were taking advantage of Caymanian opportunities came through work. And one of the ways I believe they need to be addressed is a stronger enforcement arm, a no-nonsense arm, because there are many violators in our community to take away jobs from Caymanians. Now, I did not, Mr. Speaker, hear much of the enforcement element within the strategic policy statement. But again, I say maybe it's not time for that to be highlighted now, but by way of saying more staff within immigration through the budget process, or more changes through the department of which the Premier is responsible for. But I hope that the government takes this into consideration because it's a priority of Caymanian survival. Also, another part that I did not hear in the strategic policy statement is enforcement of Caymanian succession planning in private sector and within government. Now, I know it's not the responsibility of the Honorable Premier and his government to deal with the civil service and proper succession planning for Caymanians, but I thought I'd take the opportunity to plug it now because it's very important. I, as a representative of Georgetown Central and the Cayman Islands people, I'm sick and tired of seeing foreigners at the head of the various different departments. We have enough intelligent Caymanians here to do any job in this country if we prepare for it properly. So it has to be a priority of those responsible for it. And the last thing in wrapping up was the focus on the youth. Mr. Speaker, if the members of this parliament recall that in my opening speech, when I was sworn in, I got up and I suggested that on the opposition side, I was speaking about the opposition, that there was 2 to 3 main members who had the focus of the youth as a priority, that being myself, the Honorable Deputy Opposition Leader, Representative of Newlands, Mr. Alva Suku, as well as the elected member for Bordentown West, Mr. Christopher Saunders. And I know it's a priority for us to focus on the next generation because politically we think differently and we focus differently. And we take different approaches to decision making. So I ask that this government consider in their decisions moving forward outside of the strategic policy statement, because I slightly doubt there's any chance of squeezing it in now. And I can't see where it can be squeezed in to a budget outside programs focused around youth. But I know within each cabinet minister's different departments that every decision they make, there can be a youth focus for Caymanians. Because until they feel accepted, they're not going to feel that Cayman is theirs. And every chance I can get to say that the youth should be considered, even to selling mangoes to the financial services, to building houses, every time I'm going to throw youth in it. So that's my generation, and I'm looking out for them. So expect to hear the word youth quite often from me. So I ask of you, please, please, please consider their focus in every decision you make. That being said, Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate the Honorable Minister for Finance. I want to congratulate the Honorable Premier Alden McLaughlin. I want to congratulate this administration so far. It's only been 3 months. I may not be sitting with you, but what I've seen so far, I am happy with.
Yes?
So I want to say also, though, but that is with follow through. So I guess I'm saying continue moving forward. From what I can see, you're on the right track. I hope that you stay committed to those commitments stated here today, and you will continue to have my support if, in fact, those steps continue forward. And Mr. Speaker, those are my contributions. Thank you, sir.
A bit of exuberance there. Does any other member wish to speak? The honorable member for Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't want to slow down the enthusiasm of the two young, Mr. Michael Gore used to call us, Turks, or freshmen. It was refreshing, Mr. Speaker, as I listened to the member from Bordentown West, my colleagues from Bordentown, and the last young man from Central. The approach that they've used, especially the edification that I personally got from the member from Bordentown West. A few months ago, he stopped by my yard and we talked, and some of the ideas that he had was quite interesting and different, and I think if given the opportunity and people understand, would make lot of difference in the way the finances of these sophisticated islands would be run. Well done, youngsters. I want to also congratulate the Honorable Premier, the Minister of Finance, and his government for bringing this upbeat and positive SPS. And I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to once again congratulate you in your position as Speaker. I'm sure you had your input into some of this stuff, knowing how you operated in the past. Well, I know how you operate. As the leader of the opposition, the honorable leader of the opposition on the side, I too feel, Mr. Speaker, that education must come to the forefront of whatever we need to shift around. I want to take my hat off to the President, education ministers, and those that have brought us to this level. But people that attended the conference at the Mary Miller Hall told me they were touched, they were moved. Is that me? But by her presentation, how it came from the heart, and to give hope to teachers that have suffered the pangs of hell, as those old people would say, the hope, the dream that they could have, and living and very close to certain teachers, the aspirations they have, and moving forward. When we look back, Mr. Speaker, on so many young Caymanians, for whatever reason, went away, got their teachers' education, certification, and came back. And it just seemed like they were left to languish in the system. Sad and unfortunate. But our new education minister, and I liked what she said, let government put its mouth, its dollars, its money where its mouth is. And I know that the government that she works with, she has that ability to impress on them something so important as education. When we look around and see what's happening in this society, and when I see some of the youngsters that come out of the school, some of them go from primary school, can hardly read. This is not good enough when I see, Mr. Speaker, the passes that are coming from the secondary level that would move them on. It must be discouraging. We need to really, really put our heart and soul into the development of education and whatever necessary. I'm sure this House, Madam Minister, will support the necessary funds to put education at the top. Policing and crime. Mr. Speaker, this is something that we must no longer, as I've used, put a foot around in this country. It's climbing, it's just seems to be coming from different, like a river going in different directions at times, from different levels. We need to be preemptive. We need to start in our primary schools. We need to start in our secondary schools, educating our children of the dangers. We need to support our police. And let's nab this thing in the bud before it gets out of hand, whatever we need to do. I'm saddened at times, Mr. Speaker, when I read the court reports and the police or whoever does the presentations on cases where the apparent gathering of evidence that would take someone to trial, it just seems to be so inadequate. And the judges, it must be embarrassing to some of the police, to the police force, to know how they're put down by these judges. What in the world is happening? Don't they send these folks on training? Mr. Premier, let us make sure we use this money in the right manner when it goes there. Glad to see Commissioner Byrne here, because the one prior to him did away with our traffic department. I just hope that something is done to deal with that, because the way that people drive on these roads, it's ridiculous. We passed legislation here in regards to cell phones. That was a waste of time. It really is a waste of time. And I'm pretty sure if you check in many of these accidents that seem to be happening so frequently, there's someone parked with one, if not two phones to their ears. What in the use coming down from Bordentown, right above the new gas station there, below the Tomlinson roundabout? They have a monitor there that has been out I don't know how long. I don't know what purpose it serves. No more than telling you that if it's working, that you're doing X miles an hour. Take the bloody thing from there and do something else with it. Utilize it in a sense. At this day and age, there's no reason why we can't catch these speeders. People just keep dying in carnage on the roads, injuries, and what's happening. I just hope that Commissioner Byrne will bring this back in a decent manner. Mr. Premier, I'm glad to see your intended increase for the seamen, veterans, and the needy. Mr. Speaker, you will remember that when we started out way back when, in the 90s, some of these people were making probably $50 to $100 a month. You kept raising when you left social services. We kept working on it. And I'm glad that it is now being done. And we'll keep going with the support of the government and from the entire Legislative Assembly. These are the most vulnerable people in Cayman that need that help. And it means so much to them, and especially the seamen and the veterans who gave so much in their life. It was pleasing also, Mr. Premier, to hear about the health care and the considered utilization of on-island tertiary care. I always wondered a few years back why, when we can get something done here, and I at times was one of those people when I had a problem with the stent that I had to go overseas. But we now have the opportunity to have these services done here, and I'm glad to hear that. Earlier on, it was talked about the increase of the facilities. I just wanted to mention, it is my understanding that when the hospital was built during my administration, it was constructed in a manner that a third floor could be added, because my understanding is there's a cement top on that facade up top. So just wanted to, he's not here at this moment, the Minister of Health, but just to let him know in the event, because it's the hospital where it is not in the direct path of the planes coming in, and it can go up to the third floor if necessary. My other concern, Mr. Premier, is the streamlining of immigration. I think it needs to be separated from the labor force. One needs to concentrate on border control, and others on the work permit regime. We need to make sure when the requests for these work permits come in, that there is no qualified Caymanian that is capable of doing this work, and someone else gets it for whatever reason. Mr. Speaker, once again, I don't need to be long because this was well put together in a short period of time. And just to thank the government for giving us, the opposition backbench, an opportunity to make the presentations to the cabinet. There's always the usual works that needs to be done, road works, street lights, and drain wells. But I will say, and I think he already knows, the Minister for Works, and I agree with him 1,000%, and I've said it over and over, you cannot build yourself out of traffic by building more roads. It's like when in the States, the sports people always say, if they build it, they will come. If you build the roads, they're going to bring more cars. If we take 10, 15, 20 million dollars and put in a proper, dependable public transportation system, it would make a lot of difference. When I look at the time that is being spent up on Linford Pearson, Mary Magdalene, the only thing that reminds me, I was amazed that they created down on the Palmetto and the other place there where you look up in the air, you must be about 150 feet up in the air, and I don't know. I guess someday someone, and I know the past ministers tried to explain to me what was going on, but whew. Anyway, let me not go on ranting and raving, but we need to focus in a positive manner, a manner that's going to be beneficial, and our money is best spent. And colleagues, the best way to spend that money is on education. It was pointed out to me, or some of us, that it's what, $60,000 or $70,000 we spend on an inmate in Northwood Prison. 72,000. We give most of our children that go overseas a little scholarship of $20,000 to $25,000. Let's prioritize. Please pray for Cayman.
Does any other member wish to speak? A member for East End. I got it written down.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you. I shall not keep you long. I was told earlier today that I'm full of hot air. Well, you know, I trust that those who said that to me will recall or know that that hot ear of advocacy on behalf of the people of this country in general, and in particular those of East End, has sent me back here 4 times. I hope they can do the same. Mr. Speaker, because there is a wall out there called a wall of fame, and one says a wall of shame too. Mr. Speaker, when I address these hallowed chambers on May the 31st, 2017, I implored, I challenged the government to put their backs to the wheel, because they were now the government. And I told them to unclench the fist of the election. Of course, the compass only picked up, unclenched the fist. And there was big thing about that. But I was challenging my good friend, the premier, who hitherto, he and I spent many years in cabinet. I was a little grateful that when he did his presentation of his motion, he humbled himself and said he was humbled by the opportunity to be back in that seat. I think he very well should be. But he also said that he knows he will not be back. But neither does he want to be back. And I understand after 2 terms in that seat, whoever serves 2 terms in that needs to go home. You need rest. Not the individual, it's the position and the rigors of that position. But when I heard the premier say, and I guess it came as a result of him knowing this is the evening of his political life. He said that this time he was going to demand results. I applaud him. I said, a little late coming, but I applaud him. I recall him telling me when we were ministers, just before the general election in 2005, he said if you didn't step on so many toes and were so demanding, we might be able to win the next election. We lost it. But I got the job done, though. I implore him to do the same now, because he's not going to go back. And he'll get it done. I told him at the time, if I stand on someone's toes, or if I stood on someone's toes, that simply meant they were too close to my face. Because your toes don't extend that much out from your body. And if I kick them in the butt, they should consider that a step forward. And that's how the job gets done. I'm glad he seems to be employing some of those now. And I hope he becomes successful and leaves a legacy of doing something. Because on the 31st of May, I also said to him that the country was expecting it. That people had fallen through the cracks, and they needed to address that situation. Mr. Speaker, one paragraph of what I said then went like this. I said, this government must, as a matter of priority, demonstrate that they have the necessary compassion to help our people. They must shed the label of being concerned with and catering to the fat cats. I said that the 31st of May. I went on to say, Mr. Speaker, I also implore the government in their second term to seek a new way forward based on mutual respect and mutual interest and mutual respect for those who have not been elected on the PPM ticket. To respect the wishes of the people's choice and unclench your fists of the election campaign. I said, the people have spoken, you are the government. You now have the responsibility to manage the affairs of this country. You are responsible for the distribution of the resources of this country. I commit to playing my role in the continued development of this country, a country that I'm extremely proud of, where others come to and want to make their home. We need to ensure it remains that way, but its resources are not out of the reach of our people. Mr. Speaker, that's the hot here that somebody was talking about earlier today. However, Mr. Speaker, as I look at this SPS, I recognize that the Premier has either put his back so hard against the wheel that has gone off the precipice. Because I can assure you this is an extremely ambitious SPS. I fervently hope that it happens. Mr. Speaker, I don't know the minute details of this, what the budget will represent. But certainly, much of the things that we presented to the government during the early part of the month, the latter part of last month, on July 25th, I see represented in here. But there are a few things that I hasten to remind the government that needs to fit in to these broad outcomes. It doesn't make sense to write it and do nothing about it. There needs to be a coming together of ideas to develop the action plan. Mr. Speaker, I will not go into the details like the member from Baden West and the leader of the opposition went into. But I will address a few of the areas that I believe that I can contribute to, providing my good friend, the Premier, does not shut a blind ear there too. Mr. Speaker, I just want to go through the broad outcomes one by one and throw in a few suggestions for the government to achieve those things. Mr. Speaker, the broad outcome number one, where it lists a strong economy to help families and businesses, where it says A, to increase support to Cayman finance. Mr. Speaker, I believe the Premier will recall that Cayman finance started during our tenure in Cabinet. I don't believe it got past its infancy until the next administration. However, it was something that we wholeheartedly supported. I, on the other hand, wanted to see it be carried much further than it is nowadays. Because finance industry in this country is one of our lifebloods, lifelines. I know the Minister for Finance has served his time therein. At the time, Mr. Speaker, what I wanted to see was a full operational quasi-government department, if we can call it that. I don't know if quasi is the right word to use, but I was talking about a joint venture between the private sector and government, where an analyst would be sitting, they would analyze what is going on in the industry worldwide. And every morning, ministers come in, they have a brief on their computer or on their desk, telling them, giving them a synopsis of what is going on financially and what to expect or what happened the day before or that night, whatever the case may be. I also believed at the time that if we had carried to that distance, government had a responsibility to subsidize it to the tune of 50%. And the private sector would have to provide the other 50%. I believe that joint partnership, should I call it, should have also included a weight off of the Attorney General's back by providing drafters for the laws and what have you, for recommendation to Cabinet and to the Attorney General for review and then on to the Cabinet. On financial matters, financial laws. And it would have a proper hierarchical structure with government represented on the board. And the rotation of the CEOs of the financial institutions being the chairperson on a yearly basis, rotated. I believe we would have gotten more done. I believe we have lost that opportunity then, but I believe it can be resurrected. We need to protect the financial industry. If we don't, we run the risk of losing all that we have built for the last 60 years, since the 50s. Mr. Speaker, I believe that partnership would have brought government that much closer to the financial industry. And we wouldn't be today worried about some businesses in the financial industry that is not giving Caymanian opportunities. I strongly believe that. I hold fast to that belief. We have allowed the financial industry, by and large, to operate unfeathered, unregulated, quote unquote. And maybe the time has come to build that relationship and ensure that not only the few, but the many benefit that much more by making our contribution into it. I believe that part of that relationship would have seen that partnership, whether we call it Cayman Finance or whatever, respond to changing trends in the financial world when the OECD, they and the likes, FATF, whatever, they would respond and then start the negotiations on matters, and then it comes to government for ratification. I believe that's the role, one of the roles that partnership should have been afforded, and we would have been much better off. Because, Mr. Speaker, you were one who was going direct and negotiating with people and the Attorney General when you all shouldn't have been. You can't appeal from Caesar to Caesar. And I believe that that's what Cayman Finance can turn into if we grasp that opportunity. So I see the government is saying they're going to increase the support to Cayman Finance. I think that the finer details of it needs to be looked into as well. For sure. I don't know how long it will take for us to graduate to that, but I believe we need more relationships within it. And no disrespect to ministers, politicians like myself. They are the people who are operating it. Let's get them to do some work. Because, Mr. Speaker, you have to understand, whether we like it or not, those people are here. If the Maples and the KPMG and the Deloitte and the Ernst and Young, if they give us bad information or bad recommendation, or we may say it affects us, but it affects them too. It is going to adversely affect them as well. So I don't expect that they're going to give me bad information. I believe that that relationship needs to be built. I really believe that. And I would encourage the government to look into that possibility. Mr. Speaker, another one that I want to speak briefly on is the removal of unnecessary regulation and bureaucracy from the small business sector. I don't know why we say in the sector. It is the law that needs to be repealed. I hope it's for the business sector. That may be a typo. Because I don't believe there's any bureaucracy in this small business sector. What we need to do, and I specifically speak to the Premier now. Mr. Speaker, there are countries in the Caribbean, and I can speak of one in particular. I'll use one as an example. Barbados. Small businesses, those on the gross income, revenue of under $1 million. Everything is free. Now that encourages entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs. We don't do that. We put every stumbling block in the way. Barbados, if you're in manufacturing, everything is free. No fees, no duties on imports or whatever. But you need to be into manufacturing. Mr. Speaker, we can see why they do that. One, to encourage small business Bajans to start small businesses. And two, to start manufacturing where it employs a lot of people. So the benefits derived go directly to the people. Small businesses, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to be too disrespectful to past members or anything, or the current members of the government, but we messed this up. We messed this up during the last administration. I'm here to say, Mr. Miller and I told them so. Mr. Speaker, hitherto, it was a right as a Caymanian to walk into the registry of companies and form a company. Since the changes, it has become a privilege to own a company in this country. The only thing you do not have to provide is dig up your grandmother and grandfather. Mr. Speaker, as long as you can prove you're Caymanian, and I spoke briefly to the Minister for Commerce recently about it. once you can provide proof that you're Caymanian, and it doesn't matter whether you're Caymanian from bucking out your toe or you were granted it, you're Caymanian, you should be able to form a company and get a business license. And I mentioned to the Minister of Commerce my thoughts on that matter as to whether or not how you comply with the requirements. Mr. Speaker, tomorrow, if one was to go to form a company, do all the details, you put down what you're going to be doing. You detail what you're going to be doing. So you're going to start a preschool. Mr. Speaker, you should be able to form a company to start a preschool without having to go get your police record. Because the education department, ministry, you have to apply there for a license to run a preschool. That's where the due diligence is done. And the conditions are placed upon you. Has nothing to do with you forming the company. It doesn't mean you're going to start a preschool by if you have been convicted for molestation or the likes. The ministry will find out. Why are we concentrating our efforts at the registry to find out what kind of person you are? Police record, this, that. I don't know. I asked the Premier to look serious like that. It needs to be amended, repealed. I better don't say repeal because that has gotten so many people in trouble in the world right now. But repealing. But at least it needs to be amended to avoid having such pitfalls for Caymanians to start their little companies. It's ridiculous. You know, then you have to submit your business plan. Really? We know how people are. Human beings are human beings, whether they're in Timbuktu or here. You don't think they're going out tell their friends that so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so starting a company? And you know what? They're going to cut your legs right from under you. We know that here in Cayman. We know it's too small. But that's the pardon gift that Wayne Pardon gave us. Anyway, he got his just reward. No, that's the truth. You know, when you tell the truth, you're a good guy, but when you tell it about the person, then you're not no good. When you say the truth on the person you're talking to, you're not no good. Mr. Speaker, I see where the government is proposing to intervene if necessary to improve the competitiveness of markets, starting with fuel.
Honorable Member, are you close to completing your speech?
No, sir.
Then we'll take the evening break till 7:15.